Hands on the wheel. Don't move.
I haven't moved. My body froze the second your lights came on.
You're not in trouble unless you make this difficult.
You stopped me before I did anything. That is the trouble.
I need a reason to trust you right now.
That's not the law. That's you deciding who deserves freedom.
Wait, what did you say your position was?
Now you see me, and suddenly I'm good to go.
Before the flashing lights ever turned on, before a single word was spoken, her body already knew something was wrong. Because in America, there is a moment, a split second, when red and blue lights fill your mirror and your heart drops not because you broke the law, but because you exist. This isn't a story about shouting. It isn't a story about violence. It's far more unsettling than that. It's a story about a polite traffic stop, a calm voice, a friendly smile, and a reason so vague, so fragile, that it vanishes the instant power walks into the conversation. Tonight, you're going to witness how easily freedom can hinge on who you are, how quietly discrimination can hide behind procedure, and how one black woman's calm strength exposed a truth America still struggles to face. Sometimes your rights don't protect you. Your status does. And if that realization makes your chest tighten just a little, you need to hear the rest of this story, because this didn't end the way most stops do. And that ending reveals everything. Stay with us. Watch until the very end. Because the most important moment isn't when the police pull her over. It's when they suddenly realize who she is. This is racist reality, where we confront the stories others are afraid to tell and turn pain into truth and truth into change. Subscribe now to Racist Reality and keep watching, because understanding this story might change how you see America forever. The stop that looks harmless. The road outside Savannah unfurled in a long, patient ribbon, darkening as the last light of evening slipped behind the trees. Spanish moss hung like tired thoughts from the branches, swaying gently in the humid air. Monica Williams drove with the windows up, the low hum of the tires and the muted rhythm of a late-night jazz station keeping her company. It was the kind of quiet that usually felt earned. She was 46 years old and her days were heavy with other people's lives. Courtrooms had a way of stealing your breath. Victims waiting for justice, defendants clinging to hope, families sitting stiff and silent as futures were weighed. Monica carried those hours with her even after she left the courthouse. But the drive home was different. It was the one space where she didn't have to be decisive or commanding or certain. Just human. She had just loosened her grip on the steering wheel when the lights came on. Red, blue, not abrupt, not aggressive. Just there, filling her mirrors, washing the inside of her car in pulsing color. The radio faded into static as her attention snapped into place. Her chest tightened before her mind could catch up. She hadn't been speeding. She knew that. She hadn't drifted. She hadn't rolled through a stop. Still, her thoughts raced the familiar path, searching for some invisible misstep that might explain what was happening. It was a reflex, one she learned long before law school, long before titles and offices and framed diplomas. She slowed, signaled carefully, and guided the car to the shoulder. Gravel crackled beneath her tires. The world narrowed to the steady flash of lights and the quiet thud of her heartbeat. Monica exhaled slowly, counting the breath the way she'd taught herself years ago. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Calm your body. Keep your hands visible. Don't give them a reason to misunderstand you. She placed her palms lightly on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed but unmistakably in view. Outside, the patrol car idled, engine humming low. The lights continued their relentless rhythm, beautiful, authoritative, and for some people terrifying. For others, reassuring. For Monica, they carried history. She caught her reflection in the side mirror, composed, professional, eyes steady. No one passing by would see the calculations running behind that calm. No one would feel the old quiet weight pressing against her ribs. The knowledge that even now, even here, she was not just a driver on her way home. She was a possibility, a question. The officer approached from behind, his footsteps measured. White male, early 30s maybe, average height. His posture was relaxed but not casual. He stopped just short of her window, angled slightly away, one hand near his belt. "Evening, ma'am," he said, His voice was polite, almost friendly. "Everything's okay." Those words were meant to soothe. They rarely did. "The reason I stopped you," he continued, "is your tag didn't come back when we ran it. I've never seen that before." Monica blinked once. Your tag didn't come back. Not expired, not suspended, not stolen. Just absent. A blank space in a system that was supposed to be precise. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her tone even. "Yeah," the officer replied, nodding slightly as if he shared her confusion. "We ran it, and nothing came up. Florida plate. Never seen that before. So that's the reason for the stop." The reason. Monica felt something settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a familiar ache. The kind that came from knowing how often uncertainty seemed to cling to people who looked like her. How often confusion became justification. How often was not knowing treated as reason enough. She met his eyes. "Okay." The officer shifted his stance, glancing back toward his patrol car. The pause stretched just long enough to register. Then, as if remembering something important, he added, "Also, your windows are really dark." There it was. The second reason. Monica nodded slowly. All right. Inside, the legal part of her mind was already awake. Window tint laws, measurement requirements, probable cause. She knew the statutes the way some people knew prayer, and she also knew this. When one explanation didn't hold weight, another was often placed beside it, as a spare key slid quietly into a pocket. From the outside, this was calm, polite, almost forgettable. From the inside, it was exhausting. This was the part no one filmed, the silent work of holding yourself together, the careful choreography of words and movements, the awareness that your smallest gesture might be misread, magnified, or used against you. The officer asked for her documentation. Monica moved deliberately, narrating her actions the way she'd learned to do. "My ID is in my purse. I'm going to reach for it now." She handed it over, her fingers steady. He glanced down at the card, then back up at her face. His expression remained neutral, but something flickered there. A momentary recalculation, a pause that suggested the story he'd been telling himself might need revision. He didn't say anything yet, and that waiting, that suspended moment where nothing overt happens, was its own kind of pain, because Monica knew how quickly things could shift. She'd seen it in body cam footage played in courtrooms. She'd heard it in voices cracking on the witness stand. The moment when a routine stop turned into a question, and the question turned into a confrontation. She thought about how many times she'd advised others to stay calm, to comply, to survive the moment and fight later. How heavy that advice felt when you lived inside it. Outside, traffic whispered past, headlights streaking by like lives untouched by this pause. Someone laughed from a passing car. Somewhere down the road, dinner tables were being set, children were being called inside, and dogs were barking at nothing. Here, time moved differently. The officer cleared his throat. "This isn't your car?" he asked, glancing at the paperwork. "No," Monica said. "It's not." He nodded. Another pause. In that space, Monica felt the full weight of what this moment represented, not just for her, but for so many others. The quiet bargain that so many Americans were asked to make: accept the interruption, accept the scrutiny, accept the uncertainty, and maybe you'll be allowed to continue. This was what nothing happening looked like. No raised voices, no force, just a subtle reminder of who had the power to stop you, to question you, to decide when you were free to move again. And that was the danger, because when injustice arrived this politely, it was easy to miss, easy to dismiss, easy to say it wasn't a problem at all. Monica stayed composed, her face calm, her posture respectful. But beneath that surface, something deeper stirred, a sadness that had nothing to do with this officer as an individual and everything to do with the system he represented. A system where confusion could become a cause. A system where curiosity could interrupt a life. A system where some people learned early that the road was never entirely theirs. She didn't know yet how the stop would end. She didn't know what the officer would do next. All she knew was that, once again, she was being asked to prove her right to simply go home. And as she waited there, lights flashing softly against the dark, a painful truth pressed against her heart. one that no badge or title could fully erase. In America, calm does not always mean safe, and innocence does not always mean free. A reason that never feels accidental. The officer stepped back toward his patrol car, Monica's identification still in his hand. The distance between them stretched, not far in feet, but wide in consequence. She watched him go, her eyes steady, her body still. This was the part of the stop that always seemed to last the longest, even when it didn't. Waiting. Waiting gave the mind room to wander, and Monica's mind knew exactly where to go. It returned, as it so often did, to memory. Not to one single moment, but to a collection of them. Small, unremarkable encounters stitched together over a lifetime. Each one is harmless on its own. Each one is quietly instructive. She remembered being 16, pulled over with friends after a football game, the officer asking questions that had nothing to do with driving. She remembered her father's voice when she first got her license, calm but firm. If you get stopped, do everything they say. Don't argue on the side of the road. She remembered how early she learned that compliance was not about guilt or innocence, but survival. Those lessons never left you. The patrol car's computer screen glowed faintly in the dark. Monica could imagine the officer's face lit by its pale light as he searched for something, anything, that might explain why he had stopped her. That was the part that hurt the most, the feeling that the reason came after the decision, a tag that didn't come back. She turned the phrase over in her mind, examining it the way she'd examined countless police reports. Words mattered. Language created reality. And that phrase, so vague, so slippery, had a way of meaning whatever the speaker needed it to mean. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a claim. It was an opening. And openings, Monica knew, were dangerous. The car felt suddenly smaller. The air is heavier. She resisted the urge to roll her shoulders, to stretch her fingers, to do anything that might be misinterpreted as nervousness. Instead, she focused on breathing, on the steady rhythm of her heart. She thought about how many people never learned this choreography, how many people believed genuinely that if you did nothing wrong, nothing bad could happen. How many people had never been taught to fear ambiguity, because ambiguity did not fall equally. When the officer returned, his expression was unchanged, neutral, professional. He handed her identification back through the open window. "So," he said, "what agency are you with?" The question landed softly, but it landed. Monica felt a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or suspicion, but she kept her face composed. "I'm with the county," she said evenly. "Second?" he asked, glancing at the paperwork again. "Yes," he nodded. "All right." There was a pause. Not the awkward kind, the assessing kind. "You know," he continued, "we run tags all the time. Traffic lights, just driving around. That's how we catch stolen vehicles and that sort of thing." Monica listened carefully. This wasn't a justification offered defensively. It was spoken casually, almost conversationally, as if he were explaining the weather. And that was precisely what made it unsettling. "We run tags all the time." She had heard that phrase before, though rarely said out loud. In courtrooms, officers spoke of stops triggered by minor violations, by observations, by routine procedure. But here on the side of the road, the philosophy revealed itself plainly. They were not reacting. They were scanning. Monica nodded slowly, signaling that she was listening. "I understand," but inside something tightened, because she knew what that sentence meant when you followed it to its logical conclusion. It meant that the road was not simply a place you traveled, it was a place where you were watched, where your presence could be checked, cross-referenced, and questioned at any moment. Not because you had done something wrong, but because you might have. It meant that freedom of movement came with conditions, and those conditions were not distributed evenly. The officer gestured vaguely toward her windows. "And as I said, the tint looks pretty dark. I don't have a meter on me, but it's something we look for." Something we look for. Monica felt the words settle in her chest, heavy with implication. Look for, scan for, search for. She thought of all the cases she'd handled where stops like this had been the beginning of something much larger. A search, a discovery, an arrest. A life redirected by a moment of looking, and she thought of how often those stories began the same way. He wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. They just ran the tag. "Can I ask," she said calmly, her voice respectful, "what the tag was run for?" The officer didn't bristle. He didn't take offense. He answered honestly. "Oh, like I said," he replied, "we run tags all the time. That's how we figure out if cars are stolen and that sort of stuff." There it was. The truth, spoken plainly. Monica felt a quiet sadness bloom behind her ribs. Not anger, not shocked. Just the dull ache of confirmation. This wasn't about her driving. It wasn't about a violation she'd committed. It was about the possibility that she might be someone worth investigating. And possibility, when paired with power, could justify almost anything. She thought about how often Black Americans were asked to explain themselves to systems that never had to explain their curiosity. How often routine became a shield against accountability. How easily mass surveillance could be framed as public safety. The officer stood there, relaxed, waiting. From his perspective, nothing unusual was happening. This was a procedure. This was normal. But Monica knew that normal did not mean just. She wondered briefly how many tags he had run that night. How many of them belonged to people who looked like her? How many stops had begun with a hunch and ended with a citation? Or worse? The question sat between them, unspoken but loud. Why this car? Why this moment? She knew the answer might never be explicit. Bias rarely announced itself. It worked quietly through patterns and instincts, through split-second decisions that felt neutral to the person making them. But to the person on the receiving end, it felt personal every time. The officer cleared his throat. "All right," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "We're good now." Just like that. No explanation of what had changed. No clarification of how the tag issue had resolved itself. No mention of the window tint that moments ago had been another reason. Monica felt a strange mix of relief and anger wash through her. Relief that the encounter was ending. Anger that it was ending without logic. Because if the tag had been suspicious before, it was still suspicious now. If the tint had been dark enough to justify a stop, it hadn't magically lightened. Nothing had changed except the officer's understanding of who she was. And that was the part that cut deepest. The realization settled slowly, heavily. The uncertainty had never been about the vehicle. It had been about the person inside it. The moment that person no longer fit the unspoken profile, the concern evaporated. Monica asked, politely, for his badge number. Then the other officers. She wrote them down carefully, her movements unhurried. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of memory. She wanted them to know that this moment would not simply dissolve into the night, that someone had noticed, that someone understood what had happened, even if it was never written down. As the officers returned to their patrol car, Monica sat for a moment longer, hands still on the wheel. Her heart slowed gradually, but the ache remained. This was what so many people meant when they said they felt targeted, even when no harm came of it. This was the quiet erosion of trust, the constant reminder that your presence required explanation. She thought about how easy it would be for someone watching this interaction to say nothing happened, how polite voices and calm gestures could disguise the imbalance underneath. How often was pain dismissed because it didn't leave a mark? But Monica knew better. She knew that as stops like this accumulated, that each one added a small weight to the soul, that each one taught the same lesson. You are being watched, and the rules may change without warning. As she pulled back onto the road, the patrol car's lights fading behind her, Monica felt the familiar resolve settle in alongside the fatigue. This wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been stopped for a reason that didn't quite make sense. Everyone who had been asked to justify their existence in a public space. Everyone who had learned painfully that in America, uncertainty often followed the same faces. And as the road stretched out ahead of her once more, quiet and dark and deceptively free, Monica carried with her a truth that demanded to be told. When a system treats curiosity as cause, freedom becomes fragile. And when that curiosity is guided by bias, spoken or unspoken, it wounds not just the person stopped, but the soul of the nation itself. When one excuse isn't enough, By the time Monica eased fully back into the flow of traffic, the patrol car was already shrinking in her rearview mirror. The red and blue lights dissolved into the darkness as if they had never existed at all. To anyone watching from a distance, the night had swallowed the moment whole. Nothing to see here. Just another car, another stretch of road. But inside Monica, the stop lingered. It always did. She drove for several minutes without turning the radio back on, the quiet pressing against her thoughts. Her hands remained steady on the wheel, but her body hadn't fully let go of the tension yet. That kind of alertness didn't disappear just because the danger had passed. It stayed, coiled low in the chest, a reminder that peace could be temporary. She replayed the words in her mind, not angrily, not obsessively, but carefully, the way she replayed testimony after a long day in court. Your tag didn't come back. Your windows are really dark. 2 explanations. Neither is fully formed. Neither clearly supported. Yet together, they had been enough to pull her over, enough to interrupt her night, enough to place her once again in that familiar position of being assessed. This was how it worked. Rarely was there a single, clean reason. Instead, there was accumulation, a stacking of justifications, each one thin on its own, layered until they felt substantial. If one reason failed, another waited in the wings. If that one wobbled, there was always something else to point to, a light that might be dim, a line that might have been crossed, a tint that looked a little too dark. Monica had seen this pattern from the other side of the courtroom more times than she could count. Officers testified with confidence, reciting a series of observations that, when strung together, sounded convincing. The defense would challenge one, then another. But by then, the damage was often done. The stop had happened, the search had occurred, the evidence had been found. The case moved forward. She understood the logic. She also understood its danger, because when justifications became interchangeable, rights became fragile. The road curved gently ahead, trees closing in on both sides. Monica slowed slightly, more out of instinct than necessity. She thought about how often the law depended not just on what was written, but on how it was practiced. How easily discretion could become distortion. The officer had admitted he didn't have a tint meter. That detail echoed in her mind. I don't have a meter, but what? But it looked dark. But it felt suspicious. But it gave him something to say if the first reason didn't hold. Monica felt a quiet bitterness rise, not toward that individual officer, but toward the system that trained people to believe that guessing was close enough, that appearances were evidence, that certainty was optional. She wondered how many people had been pulled deeper into the system because of a guess. How many lives had been altered because a hunch had been allowed to masquerade as cause. She thought of Marcus, a young man she'd prosecuted years earlier, not because she believed he was guilty, but because the evidence had been there. The procedure followed. He'd been stopped for drifting slightly within his lane. The officer had added that the car smelled like marijuana. A search followed. Drugs were found. Case closed. Marcus had cried quietly when the verdict was read. Not because he hadn't made mistakes, but because the stop itself had never felt fair. Monica remembered the look in his mother's eyes, the way grief and resignation seemed to share the same space. If one excuse isn't enough, Monica thought now, you just add another. That was the part that haunted her, because it meant that innocence alone could not protect you. It meant that compliance did not guarantee safety. It meant that the rules could stretch to fit the moment. She drove past a darkened gas station, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The emptiness of the place reminded her of how alone these moments could feel when you were living them. No jury, no audience, no one to object or interrupt. Just you, the officer, and the weight of discretion. People often asked her why she didn't just challenge the stop outright. Why didn't she argue on the roadside, demand explanations, assert her rights with the confidence of someone who knew the law inside and out? The answer was simple and painful, because knowing your rights did not make you immune to risk, because asserting yourself too forcefully could be read as defiance, because questions could be interpreted as attitude, because tone mattered more than truth in those moments. Monica had learned long ago that survival often required restraint. That lesson too came with a cost. As she drove, she imagined a different version of the stop. One where the officer, upon realizing the tag hadn't come back, simply made a note and moved on. One where uncertainty was acknowledged as uncertainty, not transformed into authority. But that wasn't the world she lived in. Instead, she lived in a world where just in case had become policy, where the possibility of wrongdoing was enough to justify intrusion, where certain people were more likely to be treated as possibilities than others. She thought of the phrase the officer had used so casually. We look for that. What did it mean to be someone others looked for? The thought sent a ripple of sadness through her. It wasn't just about policing, it was about belonging, about who was assumed to fit and who was assumed to be out of place. Her car hummed steadily beneath her, engine smooth, everything functioning exactly as it should. There was nothing wrong with the vehicle, nothing wrong with her. And yet, for those few minutes, the burden had been on her to prove it. That inversion, the citizen proving innocence to the state, felt like a quiet betrayal of the values she had sworn to uphold. Monica believed in law. She believed in accountability. She believed in public safety. Those beliefs were why she did the work she did, why she carried the weight of other people's stories day after day. But belief did not require blindness. She knew that systems, like people, could drift. Those intentions could curdle when unchecked. That power, once normalized, rarely questioned itself. The officer hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't done anything that would make headlines. And that was precisely why this moment mattered. Because injustice did not always announce itself with force. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wrapped in procedure and politeness, leaving behind nothing tangible to point to. Just a feeling, a tightening in the chest, a lingering doubt, a reminder of vulnerability. Monica thought of how many people carried that feeling with them every day. How many adjusted their routes, their clothing, their posture, their tone of voice in response to it. How many had learned to manage not just their behavior, but their existence? The road opened up ahead, the city lights of Savannah faint on the horizon. She could almost see home now, the promise of rest, of familiarity, of walls that did not question her presence. But the stop had left its mark. She knew that tomorrow she would walk back into the courthouse and argue for justice with clarity and conviction. She would speak of rights, of due process, of the balance between authority and liberty. And she would mean every word. Yet tonight she carried a quieter truth with her. That's when one excuse isn't enough. The system does not stop, it adapts. That is when curiosity is allowed to justify intrusion, everyone becomes vulnerable, and that the people most affected are often the ones least able to push back. As she turned onto her street, Monica felt a resolve settle alongside the fatigue. Not anger, not bitterness, something steadier, a commitment to remember. Because stories like this did not always end in tragedy. Sometimes they ended exactly like this one, with a polite goodbye and a drive home. And those were the stories most likely to be forgotten. But forgetting was a luxury Monica could not afford. Not when she knew how easily these small moments accumulated. Not when she knew how deeply they shaped trust. Not when she knew that a nation built on equality could not survive on excuses. She parked her car, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. For a moment she sat there, hands resting in her lap, eyes closed. Then she opened the door and stepped into the night. The air was warm. The street was quiet. Everything looked normal. And that, she knew, was exactly why this story needed to be told. We run tags all the time. The phrase stayed with Monica long after she had shut the car door behind her and stepped into the quiet of her home. We run tags all the time. It sounded so ordinary, so reasonable, like a line lifted straight from a policy manual and softened for public consumption. But Monica knew how much truth could hide inside ordinary words. She had built her career on unpacking them, on exposing what they allowed and what they erased. That night, sleep came slowly. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the soft glow of the patrol car's computer screen reflected in the windshield. She imagined the quiet tapping of keys, the casual efficiency with which license plates were entered and checked, again and again, like fishing lines cast into dark water. Not because of danger, not because of behavior, just because. Morning light eventually crept into her bedroom, pale and forgiving. Monica lay still for a moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic waking up, the city stretching into another day. Somewhere officers were already on the road. Somewhere tags were being run. She rose, showered, dressed, and moved through her morning routine with practiced ease. Coffee brewed. News murmured from the television. The world continued exactly as it always had. That, she thought, was part of the problem. By the time she reached her office, the stop had settled into her bones. Not as fear, but as clarity. She carried it with her into the courthouse. Through security, past familiar faces. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked, confident, respected, known. And yet she couldn't stop thinking about the thousands of people who moved through similar moments without that armor. People whose names meant nothing to the system. People whose questions were treated as challenges rather than rights. During a brief lull between meetings, Monica sat at her desk and stared at the file open in front of her. Though she wasn't really seeing it, her thoughts drifted back to the officer's casual explanation, offered without hesitation or defensiveness. That's how we figure out if cars were stolen. The implication was simple. Constant surveillance was justified by the possibility of catching wrongdoing. The net was wide by design. Innocence was collateral. From a distance, it sounded efficient. From inside it, it felt invasive. Monica thought about the way technology had quietly transformed policing. License plate readers mounted on poles, on cars, on trailers parked unobtrusively at intersections. Databases cross-referencing movement, time, and location. Systems built to remember what humans could not. She did not oppose technology. She understood its value. But she also understood how power expanded when it was automated, how discretion multiplied when it was hidden behind screens and algorithms. When an officer said, "We run tags all the time," what he was really saying was this: you are always potentially under review. That awareness changed something fundamental about how freedom was experienced. Freedom, Monica believed, was not just the absence of chains. It was the ability to move without explanation, to exist without suspicion, to travel without the quiet knowledge that you might be interrupted at any moment. Not because of what you had done, but because of what you might represent. She thought of her mother, who still tensed visibly whenever she saw flashing lights in the distance. A woman who had never broken the law, who had worked her entire life, who carried herself with dignity and care. Still, the fear lingered. Still, the body remembered. Generational memory did not require personal experience. It traveled through stories, through warnings, through the tone of voice parents used when giving advice they wish they didn't have to give. Don't reach too fast. Keep your hands where they can see them. Be respectful, no matter what. Those were not lessons of citizenship. They were lessons of survival. Monica wondered how many children were being taught those same rules that very morning, their parents' voices heavy with love and fear. How many parents felt the quiet heartbreak of knowing that the world would ask their children to be careful in ways others never had to be? In court later that day, an officer testified about a stop that had begun with a routine plate check. Monica listened closely, her face composed, her questions precise. She challenged inconsistencies, probed timelines, and asked about procedure. But beneath the professional exchange, something else stirred. She wondered whether the officer understood how revealing that phrase was, how much it said about the power imbalance baked into everyday interactions, how it framed citizens not as people to protect, but as data points to be evaluated. The courtroom was calm, orderly, controlled, but the reality behind the testimony was anything but. "We run tags all the time" means that the state has permitted itself to watch constantly, to interrupt freely, to justify intrusion retroactively. It meant that the line between suspicion and certainty had blurred, and when that line blurred, bias found room to breathe. Monica did not need to accuse anyone of racism to recognize patterns. Patterns were visible in numbers, in outcomes, in the stories that crossed her desk year after year. Certain neighborhoods, certain names, certain faces. Bias did not always announce itself with slurs or hostility. More often, it whispered through habits and assumptions, through choices about which tags to run and which to ignore, through instincts shaped by stereotypes absorbed long before an officer ever pinned on a badge. Who looked out of place? Who looked worth checking? Who looked like trouble? These decisions happened quickly, often unconsciously, but their impact was cumulative and profound. By the time Monica left the courthouse that evening, the sky had darkened again, clouds gathering low and heavy. She walked to her car with measured steps, keys in hand, alert in a way she wished she didn't have to be. As she drove, she paid attention to the traffic around her. A luxury SUV glided past, windows tinted, just as dark as hers. A minivan followed, bumper stickers advertising a child's honor roll and a family vacation. A battered sedan idled at a light, paint peeling, engine rattling. She wondered which of those tags would be run. The question made her throat tighten, because if the process were truly random, if surveillance were truly neutral, the outcomes would look different. The burden would feel lighter. Trust would not erode so predictably. But Monica knew better. She knew that when a system relied on discretion without accountability, it mirrored the biases of the society that built it. Technology did not erase prejudice. It amplified it, gave it reach and speed and plausible deniability. No one had to say, "I stopped her because she was black." They only had to say, "We run tags all the time." That phrase carried just enough truth to shield everything beneath it. At a red light, Monica watched a patrol car pull alongside her. Her heart rate ticked up before she could stop it. The light turned green, and the officer drove on without a glance. Relief washed through her, followed immediately by frustration, with herself, with the system, with the fact that this reaction had become so automatic. She thought of the millions of Americans who lived in that constant state of readiness, the toll it took on bodies and minds, the way it chipped away at trust, at belonging, at the simple joy of moving through the world unburdened. When Monica reached home, she sat in her car for a moment before getting out, listening to the rain begin to tap softly against the roof. She thought about how easy it would be to let the stop fade into memory, to file it away as just another moment, just another inconvenience. But she also knew how dangerous forgetting could be. Because when surveillance became routine, when interruptions became normalized, when explanations stopped being required, freedom did not vanish all at once. It eroded quietly, politely, one routine check at a time. Monica believed in a better vision of America, one where safety did not require suspicion, one where technology served the people rather than watched them, one where dignity was not conditional. She believed that love, real love for one another, required vigilance. It required the courage to question systems even when they wore the language of protection. It required empathy for those who bore the weight of policies others barely noticed. That night, as rain streaked down her window and the city hummed beyond it, Monica made a quiet promise to herself. She would keep telling the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. She would keep asking questions, even when the answers were inconvenient. And she would keep believing that America could be stronger, not through control, but through trust. Because a nation that watched its people constantly without reflection did not grow safer. It grew smaller. And a nation that listened, truly listened, to the pain of its people had a chance to become something better, something worthy of all of them. The moment power shifts, the moment did not announce itself with drama. There was no sharp intake of breath, no raised voice, no sudden movement. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, like a fault line revealing itself only after the ground had already begun to move. The officer stood at Monica's window, her identification still in his hand. The night was calm, the road behind them mostly empty now. Crickets hummed somewhere in the dark, indifferent to the tension that hung in the air. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Those seconds mattered. Monica watched his face, not with fear, but with the practiced attention of someone who had learned to read pauses. She recognized the look. She had seen it on jurors when testimony took an unexpected turn. On witnesses, when a question landed closer to the truth than they were prepared for. Recognition. He had seen her title. She didn't announce it loudly. She didn't wield it like a weapon. When she spoke, it was calm, almost understated, the way she spoke in court when she wanted facts, not theatrics, to do the work. "I'm a county prosecutor," she said. That was all. No challenge, no demand, just information. The air changed. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The officer's shoulders eased. His posture shifted ever so slightly from authority to accommodation. His voice softened when he spoke again, the edges rounding off. "Oh," he said. "Okay." That single syllable carried a great deal of weight. In that moment, Monica felt two conflicting sensations collide inside her. Relief came first, an involuntary loosening of the chest, a quiet acknowledgement that the encounter was unlikely to escalate further. But it was followed immediately by something heavier. Clarity, because nothing about the car had changed. The tag was no more legible than it had been seconds before. The windows were no lighter. The database had not magically corrected itself. No new information had emerged that could explain why the stop no longer mattered. Nothing had changed, except who he thought she was. The officer handed her ID back, his movements now efficient, almost eager to conclude the interaction. "We're good now," he said. "Have a good night." "We're good now." Monica nodded, her expression composed, but inside her thoughts raced. The phrase echoed sharply in her mind, louder than the flashing lights ever had. "We're good now." Who was we? And why now? If the stop had been justified, it should have remained justified. If the concern had been legitimate, it should have required resolution. Law did not bend a resume, or at least it wasn't supposed to. Yet here it was bending. The realization settled with a painful precision. The stop had never truly been about the car. It had been about the person they imagined behind the wheel. The moment that the imagined person no longer fit a familiar narrative, the concern dissolved. Monica felt the ache of that truth spread slowly, like cold through her veins. She thought of all the people who would never have this moment, people who could not end a stop with a single sentence, people whose identities did not trigger deference, but suspicion. She thought of the mother driving home from a late shift, exhausted and wary, the college student navigating unfamiliar roads, the young man whose hoodie seemed to weigh more than his words ever could. Would they hear, "We're good now"? Or would the questions continue, multiplying, searching for something, anything to justify their presence on the roadside? Monica knew the answer, even if she wished she didn't. The officer took a step back, already turning toward his patrol car. The interaction was over, or so it appeared. But Monica stayed still for a moment longer, hands resting on the steering wheel. The night felt different now, not because danger had passed, but because the illusion had cracked. She realized with a quiet sadness that her safety in that moment had not come from the strength of the law. It had come from proximity to power. That knowledge sat uneasily with everything she believed in. Monica had dedicated her life to the idea that justice should be blind, that the law should apply equally without regard to status, wealth, or influence. She had argued those principles passionately, publicly, and sincerely. And yet here she was, benefiting from the very imbalance she fought against. The contradiction hurt. She wondered whether the officer realized what he had revealed, whether he understood how transparent the shift had been, or whether to him it felt natural, an instinctive recalibration once he recognized someone from his side of the system. That was the danger of power dynamics. They often felt invisible to those who benefited from them. Monica thought back to the early days of her career, when she still believed that knowledge alone could protect her. She remembered walking into rooms where she was the youngest, the only woman, the only black face, and feeling the weight of assumptions before she ever opened her mouth. She had learned then that authority was not simply granted by position. It was negotiated, often unevenly, through perception. Tonight, perception had done its work swiftly. As the patrol car pulled away, Monica did not start driving immediately. She sat there, the engine idling softly, listening to the sound of her own breathing. She felt a surge of emotion, anger, gratitude, grief, all braided together in a way that left her momentarily breathless. She was grateful the stop had ended without escalation. She was angry that it had required her status to do so. And she grieved for everyone who did not have that shield. This was the part of the story that was hardest to explain to people who had never lived it. The complexity of feeling relieved and violated at the same time. The discomfort of knowing you were spared, not because the system worked, but because you were recognized as someone who could push back. Monica's phone buzzed softly on the seat beside her, a message from a colleague asking about a meeting the next day. Life continued, oblivious to the small moral earthquake that had just occurred. She put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. As she drove, her thoughts turned inward, reflective and heavy. She imagined the same stop unfolding differently, imagined herself as someone else. Same car, same road, same night, but without the authority to reframe the encounter. In that version, the officer might have lingered longer, might have asked more questions, might have requested consent to search, might have found a reason, however minor, to extend the stop. The difference between those outcomes hinged not on legality, but on power. Monica felt a tightening in her throat as the implications settled fully. This was not just a personal experience. It was a window into a two-tier reality, one where the law, in practice, responded differently depending on who stood before it. She thought of how often people were told, "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." How hollow that phrase sounded now. Fear was not born of guilt. It was born of unpredictability. As she approached a red light, she caught sight of her reflection again in the windshield. A composed face, a calm exterior. No visible trace of the emotional reckoning unfolding beneath the surface. She wondered how many others drove like this every day, carrying invisible burdens no one asked about. The light turned green. She drove on. By the time Monica reached home, the night had deepened, stars faintly visible between clouds. She parked and sat quietly, the engine ticking as it cooled. She rested her forehead briefly against the steering wheel, allowing herself a moment of unguarded honesty. This was not the America she wanted. Not an America where freedom depended on credentials. Not an America where justice bowed to familiarity. Not an America where dignity was rationed. And yet she believed, fiercely, that it could be better. She believed that moments like this, when examined honestly, could become catalysts rather than cautions. That exposure could lead to accountability. That empathy could grow where denial once lived. Monica stepped out of the car and into the night air. It was quiet, peaceful, almost serene. The world gave no sign of the imbalance she had just witnessed. She locked the car and walked toward her door, carrying with her a renewed sense of purpose. Because if power could end a stop in seconds, then truth, shared, spoken, and understood, could end something larger. And if America was ever going to become the place it promised to be, it would have to confront these moments not with defensiveness, but with humility. Not with excuses, but with love. Love for those who were stopped. Love for those who feared. Love for a nation still learning how to treat all its people as fully human. The power shift that night had revealed a hard truth, but it had also lit a path forward, one where awareness could become action and where justice finally could mean the same thing for everyone. The question of race. There was a question that hovered over the entire encounter, unspoken but heavy, like humidity before a storm. It followed Monica into the house that night. It followed her through her work the next day. It followed her in the quiet moments when there was nothing left to distract her. Was race the reason? Monica was trained to be careful with conclusions. As a prosecutor, she knew better than most how dangerous assumptions could be. She had spent years insisting on evidence, on standards, on proof beyond a reasonable doubt. She did not believe in accusing without cause. And yet, some truths did not arrive as evidence. They arrived as patterns, as echoes, as lived experience repeated too often to dismiss. She could not look into the officer's heart. She could not say, with certainty, what motivated him when he ran her tag. She could not prove that her skin color was the deciding factor. But she could ask the harder, more honest question. Who gets stopped like this most often? That question had answers. They were written in statistics, in studies and stories, whispered across dinner tables, and shouted in protests. They were etched into the collective memory of Black Americans who had learned early that visibility was a risk. Monica thought back to the moment the officer said, "I've never seen that before." The words were simple, but they carried a familiar weight. Otherness. The suggestion that something did not belong, that it required explanation, that it stood out in a way that demanded scrutiny. She had heard that language before, not always from police, but from neighbors, co-workers, strangers. "You're so articulate. Where are you really from? You don't seem like..." Each comment, polite on its surface, carried the same implication. You are unexpected here. That was how bias often spoke, not with cruelty, but with curiosity, not with accusation, but with doubt. Monica replayed the scene again, this time imagining a different driver. What if it had been a 20-year-old black man driving that same car? Same windows, same tag, same road. Would the officer's confusion have hardened into suspicion? Would the questions have multiplied instead of dissolved? What if it had been a nurse coming off a double shift, too tired to choose her words carefully? Would fatigue have been read as attitude? Would silence have been read as evasiveness? What if it had been a white man in a suit? Would the tag have been run at all? These were not hypothetical games. They were the quiet calculations people made every day, often unconsciously, shaped by narratives older than any individual officer. Monica knew that racial profiling was rarely dramatic. It did not require hatred. It did not require intent. It only required patterns left unexamined. The officer had said they ran tags all the time. But all the time did not mean everyone equally. In the moving river of traffic, choices had to be made. Plates could not all be run at once. Someone decided which cars were worth the keystrokes. Those decisions happened quickly, instinctively. And instincts, Monica knew, were shaped by the world we absorbed. She thought about the images that dominated news cycles, the stories that filled crime reports. The faces are most often associated with danger in popular culture. Even well-meaning people were not immune to those influences. Bias did not require malice. It required repetition. The pain of that realization pressed against her chest, because it meant that even good intentions could still produce harm, that people could believe they were being fair while participating in systems that were anything but. Monica had seen this disconnect play out in courtrooms time and again. Officers genuinely confused when their actions were questioned. Prosecutors surprised by accusations of bias. Jurors are reluctant to believe that something so ordinary could be unjust. It was easier to believe in individual fairness than to confront systemic imbalance. But Monica knew that systems were made of people, and that patterns emerged not from a single bad act, but from countless small decisions that went unchallenged. She thought again of how abruptly the stop had ended once her status was known. The speed of that reversal was telling. It suggested that the officer understood on some level that he was standing on uncertain ground. If the stop had been solid, he would have continued. If the justification had been clear, he would have explained it. If the law had been firmly on his side, he would not have retreated. Instead, he backed away. That retreat spoke volumes. It suggested that the stop lived in a gray area, one that depended heavily on who was being questioned. And gray areas were where bias thrived. Monica felt a wave of sadness, not just for herself, but for the countless people whose encounters never ended so cleanly. For the ones whose stops escalated because they lacked the social armor she carried. For the ones whose questions were met with suspicion instead of answers. She thought of her younger cousin, barely 21, who had called her once late at night, voice shaking after being stopped for looking nervous. She remembered how carefully she had coached him through the aftermath, how angry she had been that such coaching was necessary at all. That was the generational wound. Not just the stops themselves, but the way they were anticipated. The way they shaped behavior before anything ever happened. The way they taught people to shrink, to soften, to disappear just enough to avoid attention. That kind of vigilance was exhausting. Monica knew that some people bristled at conversations about race and policing. They insisted that mentioning it was divisive, that it cast unfair blame. They preferred explanations that focused on procedure rather than impact. But Monica believed that love required honesty, and honesty demanded that America look directly at the ways race influenced perception, suspicion, and power. This was not about labeling every officer as racist. It was about acknowledging that racial bias could exist even when no one intended harm, that outcomes mattered as much as intentions. Those patterns revealed truths that individuals might not see in themselves. She believed that confronting these realities did not weaken the country. It strengthened it, because ignoring pain did not make it disappear. It only allowed it to fester. As the days passed, Monica noticed how the memory of the stop continued to surface at unexpected moments. when she saw patrol cars parked along the road, when she watched news footage of traffic stops gone wrong, when she listened to colleagues dismiss concerns with casual reassurance. Each time the ache returned, not sharp, but persistent. She wondered how many Americans carried similar aches quietly. How many felt unseen, unheard, dismissed when they tried to articulate experiences that did not fit neat narratives. She wondered how many wanted to believe in fairness, but struggled to reconcile belief with reality. Monica did not want an America defined by fear or resentment. She wanted an America brave enough to examine itself, compassionate enough to listen, humble enough to change. She believed that acknowledging racial bias was not an act of accusation, but an act of care. Care for the people stopped. Care for the officers asked to wield enormous power. Care for a system that could not afford to lose public trust. That night, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold, Monica wrote a few notes in a small journal she kept for moments like this. Not legal analysis, not arguments, just truths she did not want to forget. She wrote about the speed of the power shift. She wrote about the silence that followed her identification. She wrote about the question that still lingered. Then she wrote something else, something hopeful. She wrote that understanding was possible, that growth was possible. America had confronted hard truths before and emerged stronger for it. But only when people were willing to feel the discomfort, only when they chose empathy over defensiveness, only when they chose love over denial. Monica closed the journal and sat quietly for a moment, hands folded, eyes soft. The question of race was not an accusation, it was an invitation to look deeper, an invitation to listen longer, an invitation to build a country where no one had to wonder whether their skin color made them suspicious. That was the America she believed in. And that belief, though tested, remained unbroken. Because hope, like justice, required work. And Monica was not done working yet. Dignity as resistance. There is a kind of strength that does not raise its voice. It does not clench its fists or announce itself with anger. It does not demand attention or leave scars that cameras can capture. It moves quietly, deliberately, and it often goes unnoticed by everyone except the people who understand how fragile moments can be. Monica understood that kind of strength. It was the strength she had carried with her that night on the roadside, when the officer said, "We're good now," and turned to leave. The strength that told her the encounter might be over, but it was not finished. She did not drive away immediately. Instead, she asked a question. "May I have your badge number?" she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. The officer paused, surprised, not offended, not defensive, just caught off guard. He gave her the number. She wrote it down carefully, her pen moving slowly across a small notepad she kept in her purse. Then she asked for the other officer's number as well. There was no accusation in her tone, no edge, just intention. That moment mattered more than it appeared, because Monica was not asserting her power to escape consequences. There were no consequences left to escape. The stop had already ended. She was not trying to embarrass anyone or provoke a reaction. She was documenting, and documentation is a form of dignity. It says, "I see what is happening." It says, "This moment counts." It says, "You are not invisible, and neither am I." Monica had learned long ago that accountability rarely began with confrontation. It began with memory, with records, with the quiet refusal to let experiences dissolve into nothing. That refusal was a kind of resistance. As she pulled away that night, badge numbers resting on the passenger seat beside her, Monica felt a steadiness settle into her chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more resolute. She knew that what she had done was small. She also knew that small acts accumulated, just like small injustices did. In the days that followed, she noticed how often she returned to that moment. Not with anger, but with clarity. It stood out because of how different it was from the stories she heard so often. Stories of people who were too afraid to speak, too shocked to remember details, too overwhelmed to document anything at all. Those reactions were understandable. Fear had a way of stealing focus, and the system relied on that. But Monica had been given something many others were not: the space to remain calm, the authority to ask questions without risking escalation, the knowledge to recognize the significance of what had just occurred. She felt a responsibility not to waste that. At work, she listened more carefully when people described their encounters with police. She noticed the details they emphasized, and the ones they struggled to articulate. She recognized the familiar patterns, vague reasons, shifting justifications, sudden changes in tone. She did not dismiss those stories. She did not minimize them. Instead, she asked questions. What did the officer say first? What changed during the interaction? How did it end? She knew that listening was its own form of resistance, because for too long, the quiet pain of these moments had been treated as insignificant, too minor to matter, too ordinary to address. Nothing happened, people said. At least you weren't hurt. At least you got to go home. But Monica knew that harm was not always measured in bruises or broken bones. Sometimes it lived in the nervous system, in the way shoulders tensed at the sight of flashing lights, in the way voices softened instinctively, in the way freedom felt conditional. Dignity, she believed, meant acknowledging that harm, even when it was subtle. It also meant modeling another way forward. She thought often about how she had spoken that night, how she had chosen restraint over confrontation, how she had kept her voice steady even as her emotions surged beneath the surface. That choice had not been about submission. It had been about control. Control of the narrative, control of the moment, control of her own humanity. Monica knew that not everyone could make that choice safely. She did not judge those who responded differently. Survival took many forms, but she also knew that dignity could be contagious. When one person demonstrated calm accountability, it made space for others to imagine doing the same. When one person documented an encounter, it reminded the system that eyes were open. This was not about punishment, it was about balance. She remembered something her grandmother had once told her, years ago, while watching the evening news together. They had been quiet for a long time, absorbing another story about injustice, another face flashing across the screen. "Baby," her grandmother had said softly, "don't let what they do take who you are." At the time, Monica hadn't fully understood. Now she did. Dignity as resistance meant refusing to let unfairness define you. It meant holding on to your values even when the system did not reflect them to you. It meant choosing love without surrendering clarity. Monica believed deeply that America needed more of that kind of resistance, not louder but wiser, not fueled by hatred but grounded in humanity. She believed that accountability could coexist with compassion, that questioning systems did not require demonizing individuals, that progress came not from humiliation, but from honesty. She also believed that love, real love, required courage. Courage to speak when silence was easier. Courage to listen when defensiveness was tempting. Courage to remain human in spaces that encouraged attachment. One evening, weeks after the stop, Monica attended a community forum on policing and trust. People gathered in a modest auditorium, folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. Officers sat alongside residents. Some faces were guarded, others weary. When it was Monica's turn to speak, she did not recount her story with drama. She told it plainly, calmly. She described the stop, the shifting reasons, the sudden end. She spoke about how it felt, not accusingly, but honestly. The room grew quiet. She did not demand apologies. She did not issue ultimatums. She simply asked the room to consider what dignity looked like, from both sides of the badge. She spoke about how small actions shaped trust, how transparency mattered, how documentation protected everyone, how love for the community required humility from those entrusted with power. When she finished, there was no applause at first, just silence. Then someone nodded, then someone else. A few people wiped their eyes. An officer shifted in his seat, thoughtful. That, Monica knew, was how change began. Not with shouting matches or viral clips, but with moments of shared recognition, with people seeing themselves in each other's stories, with pain acknowledged rather than dismissed. As she drove home that night, the road familiar and calm, Monica felt a quiet pride, not in herself, but in the possibility she saw unfolding. The possibility that dignity could interrupt patterns. The possibility that love could coexist with accountability. The possibility that America could grow by listening to its own people. She knew progress would be slow. She knew resistance would persist. She knew not every story would end as hers had. But she also knew this: every act of dignity planted a seed, and seeds, given time and care, could change landscapes. Monica pulled into her driveway and turned off the engine. The house lights glowed warmly, welcoming her inside. For a moment she sat there, reflecting on the journey, not just the drive home, but the larger one she was part of. She thought of all the people who had been stopped, questioned, searched, dismissed. She thought of all the officers navigating a system that often failed to teach them how to wield power humanely. She thought of a country still struggling to reconcile its ideals with its practices. And she felt something unexpected rise within her. Hope, not naive hope, not blind optimism, but a grounded belief that dignity, quiet, persistent, and rooted in love, could still make a difference. That belief steadied her, because resistance did not always look like a protest. Sometimes it looked like a woman on the side of the road, calmly writing down a badge number, refusing to let the moment disappear. And sometimes that was enough to begin changing everything. The lesson: love, unity, and a stronger America. When Monica Williams finally allowed herself to sit with the full weight of what had happened, she realized something surprising. The stop itself had ended days ago, but its lesson was still unfolding. It lived in the way she listened more carefully now, in the way she watched people move through the world with new attentiveness, in the way she noticed how easily power shifted, how quietly it announced itself, and how deeply it shaped lives long after the flashing lights disappeared. She knew that many people would watch a story like hers and shrug. Nothing happened. No one was hurt. Everyone was polite. And on the surface, those statements were true. But Monica had spent her life learning that truth had layers, that harm did not always scream, that injustice often whispered, soft enough to be ignored, persistent enough to matter. This was one of those moments. The most unsettling realization was not that she had been stopped. It was why she had been allowed to go. She had driven away freely that night, not because the system had corrected itself, but because she had been recognized as someone who belonged inside it. Her freedom had been granted not by equal protection, but by proximity to authority. That truth was uncomfortable. It challenged the comforting story America liked to tell about itself, that fairness was automatic, that rights were evenly distributed, that justice worked the same for everyone. Monica knew better. She had seen the other side of that equation too many times. The drivers who stayed longer at the window, the questions that kept coming. The searches were justified by nothing more than persistence. The outcomes that followed, not because of guilt, but because of vulnerability. This was the quiet divide running beneath everyday life. Status versus rights. And it was a divide that weakened the nation, because a country could not call itself strong when dignity depended on credentials. A democracy could not thrive when freedom required fluency in power. People could not fully trust one another when the law treated some as suspects first and citizens second. Monica did not want an America built on fear. She wanted an America brave enough to look at itself honestly. That honesty required acknowledging pain, not to dwell in it, but to heal it. It required listening to stories that made people uncomfortable, not defensive. It required understanding that calling out injustice was not an act of hatred, but an act of love. Love for the people harmed. Love for the ideals America claimed to stand for. Love for a future that could be better than the present. She thought of the officers too, not as symbols, but as human beings operating inside a system that asked them to make rapid judgments with enormous consequences. She believed that accountability was not the same as condemnation, that reform did not require vilification. True strength, she believed, came from humility, the willingness to say, "We can do better." Monica imagined a different kind of encounter, one where stops were grounded in clear, objective reasons, one where explanations were offered freely and respectfully, one where curiosity did not substitute for cause. She imagined an America where parents did not have to rehearse survival lessons with their children, where dignity was assumed, not negotiated, where love of country included loving all the people in it, especially those who had been asked to endure the most. That vision did not feel naive to her. It felt necessary, She knew that change did not arrive all at once. It came in increments, in conversations, in policies, in choices made on ordinary days by ordinary people. It came when someone chose to listen instead of dismiss, when someone chooses empathy instead of denial, when someone chooses love instead of fear. Monica saw those choices being made quietly all around her. She saw them in the community meetings where residents and officers spoke honestly for the first time, in the classrooms where young people asked harder questions about justice, in the colleagues who reconsidered assumptions they had never thought to examine before. She saw them in herself too. The stop had not hardened her. It had clarified her purpose. She felt a renewed commitment to the work she did, not just as a prosecutor, but as a citizen, a neighbor, a human being invested in the well-being of others. She knew that America's story was complicated. It carried deep scars alongside remarkable resilience, that its history was marked by both exclusion and progress. But she also knew this: progress had never come from pretending those scars did not exist. It came from people willing to confront them with courage and compassion. As the weeks passed, the memory of the flashing lights softened, but the lesson remained sharp. Monica carried it with her as a reminder, not of fear, but of responsibility. A responsibility to speak when silence was easier. A responsibility to protect dignity wherever she could. A responsibility to model the kind of love she wanted to see reflected. Because love, she believed, was not passive. Love asked questions. Love demanded fairness. Love insisted that everyone be treated as fully human. One evening, walking through her neighborhood as the sun dipped low and children played in front yards, Monica felt a swell of something she hadn't expected. Pride. Not a fragile pride that ignored flaws, but a grounded pride rooted in possibility. Pride in the people who kept pushing the country forward, even when it resisted. Pride in the resilience of communities that refused to be defined by harm alone. She believed that America was strongest when it chose kindness over cruelty, unity over division, truth over comfort. And she believed that every person had a role to play in that choice. Not everyone would face a traffic stop that revealed power so clearly, but everyone would face moments where they could choose how to respond to injustice, whether to look away or lean in, whether to judge or understand, whether to fear or love. Monica hoped that when people heard stories like hers, they would not walk away angry or hopeless. She hoped they would walk away changed, more aware, more compassionate, more determined to help one another. Building a stronger America did not begin in courtrooms or legislatures alone. It began in hearts willing to expand, in minds open to learning, in hands ready to lift rather than push away. The lesson of that quiet stop on a dark road was not about one officer or one driver. It was about all of us, about whether we would allow subtle injustice to pass unnoticed, or whether we would meet it with dignity, empathy, and resolve, about whether we would cling to comforting myths or embrace hard truths that could set us free. Monica chose the latter. She chose love, not the easy kind, but the courageous kind, the kind that listens, the kind that learns, the kind that builds. And as she moved forward into her work, her community, her country, she carried with her a simple, powerful belief that America's greatest strength had never been perfection. It had always been the people who believed it could be better and worked together to make it so. That belief, once awakened, could not be stopped. And in that belief, there was hope enough for everyone. What happened on that quiet road wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It didn't end in handcuffs or headlines. And that's exactly why it matters. Because this story reminds us that injustice doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it says, "You're good now," and walks away, leaving behind a truth that's hard to sit with. The truth is this: a stronger America cannot be built on fear, status, or silent inequality. It can only be built on fairness, empathy, and love for one another. This story isn't about blaming. It's about understanding. It's about seeing how power works when we're not looking and choosing to do better. When we listen to experiences like this, we grow. When we acknowledge pain instead of dismissing it, we heal. When we stand up for dignity, quietly or boldly, we strengthen the soul of this country. No one should need a title to feel safe. No one should need power to be treated as human. And no one should be left alone in moments that shake their sense of belonging. America is strongest when we protect one another, when we refuse to discriminate, when we choose kindness over suspicion, unity over division, and love over fear. If this story moved you, if it made you reflect or feel or see things differently, then stay with us. Subscribe to the Racist Reality channel and visit the channel to watch more stories that expose truth, honor humanity, and call us all to be better. Because change begins with awareness. Strength begins with compassion, and a better America begins with us. Choosing to see one another, stand together, and build something worthy of everyone. Thank you for watching.